Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. And today I have with me a very special guest. I have SJ Thomason.
Hi, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
I have a hard time getting theists on, and I think as I grow a little in popularity, it may get a little easier because some of the theists that I do interact with on a regular basis are not usually YouTubers. They're not content creators, and they're very shy about coming on a live stream. But as I get a little bit more popularity, I might be able to reach out to some of the content creators, people that are a little more comfortable in front of a camera, like SJ. I do want to do a couple of housekeeping things. In the description of this video, I have put the link to SJ's YouTube channel, and I have also put the link to SJ's Twitter. Now, SJ's Twitter is a private page, so if you do want to contact her on Twitter, you will need to contact her and get permission to be admitted before you can't just interact with her directly without permission. Another thing I wanted to bring up is in a previous stream, I did have some complaints because I had a theist on, and there were a couple of theists in the chat, and some of the theists in the chat felt that they were discriminated against because their ideas got them timed out. And people are welcome to express any idea they want, provided it is not a personal attack on either SJ, myself, or anyone in the chat or anyone else, provided it is not a call for violence or a call for any kind of inappropriate behavior. With that, all ideas are welcome. So for those who are mods in the chat, anyone can express any idea they want. The only prohibition is against violence or personal attacks. Okay, with those housekeeping things out of the way, SJ, I'm going to give you a chance to just say hello and introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about yourself and your channel.
Hi, well, thank you so much for having me on. I have a channel, it's just called SJ Thomason. It's kind of not very original title, but I've created a Psalm 23 apologetics is what I call it. And I have a blog that I write that's called Christian-apologist.com. If you want to follow my Twitter account, you might want to contact me through the blog. You'll see a contact information there, and just send me an email and we can chat. And that's actually how I got in contact with Godless Granny. So she sent me an email and reached out, and then now we're connected on Twitter. And so it's been pretty nice, and we've had some pretty good interactions. And so I'm an educator. I live in I live in Florida, and I'm a Christian, and I teach university classes.
Okay. If you're okay with saying, what university do you teach at?
University of Tampa.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Okay. The topic that I've kind of picked for this, and it's a rather loose topic, we may stray from that topic, we may go wherever the topic ends up taking us, but I kind of wanted to start with free will versus sin. And part of the reason I wanted to start with this topic is I recently did a live stream with Steve Tiger, and we were talking about this, and we were talking about a lot of the impossibilities of the existence of the attributes that are given to the God of the Bible, and these concepts of free will and sin. And one of the comments I did get was, you really should talk to a theist about this. And I said, yeah, if one will come, I'll gladly do it. And then SJ said she would come. So my first question to you, SJ, is do you believe in original sin?
Yes, but I have to qualify it because my belief is slightly different than I think some other theists on original sin.
Okay.
And so there's a couple of things in the Bible. So one of the things that we believe goes back to Adam and Eve, and that Adam and Eve had the first fall, and that ever since then, every human on the planet has the ability to sin, and every human does sin if you live to an age where it would be considered sin. And so humans, according to Romans 3:23, all fall short of the glory of God. And so we just are flawed. And that's what Christians believe. We're flawed people, and we're just trying to do better in life and get closer to Christ.
Okay. And so do you believe that people are born with original sin, that people are born sinners?
That's what I meant to go into. Okay, so thank you for continuing that question. that is the idea that, see, I believe that babies are incapable of sinning because they're incapable of language. And because they don't have language, they can't put their thoughts together. And so they're not actually even have the ability to sin until they're able to have language. And that's why people don't remember anything that they did as an infant. Some people will say they remember that, but you honestly didn't have the language to be able to string the thoughts together and make sense of activities and actions and your surroundings. And so until you're able to make sense of it, then you're able to sin. And so the idea with original sin is they go back and they say that babies are born with sin. I would say that babies are born with the ability to sin, and that they do go ahead and sin once they get to the age, a little bit older of an age.
Now, first you said that babies don't have the ability to sin because they don't have language, and then you said they do have the ability to sin because they're born with it.
No, they're always, let me clarify, they always have the ability to sin, but they won't sin. They won't actually physically be able to sin until they can put language together.
What's the difference between being able to do something and having the ability to do something?
Well, like I have the ability to throw myself down the stairs, but I'm not going to throw myself down the stairs. But it's just, you have an ability. You have a lot of abilities. And so the exercising the ability is different.
Okay, yeah, there's a difference between having an ability and exercising that ability. But what's the difference between having an ability and being able to do something?
I would say that's pretty much about the same. So,
okay, but you said babies are not able to sin.
Oh, I guess that's probably not the best choice of language. I would just say that babies don't sin. So
okay.
Now some theists do argue that babies do sin, and so
right.
And
yeah,
so I don't think that I would say that an infant at 6 months old, because the infant's crying because he or she's hungry, is sinning in any way.
I would certainly agree with you there. The Calvinist doctrine says that babies are born with original sin attached to them, and for that reason they are sinners from birth. So if we do you think people are sinners at birth, even though they don't have the ability to exercise that sinful nature at that point? In other words, are you born with a sinful nature?
Yes, I would say you're born with a sinful nature.
Okay. Do you think people who think that babies are sinful from birth are Christians?
Oh, sure. I know a lot of Christians who think that way.
Okay.
I think that was taught by Thomas Aquinas too, if I'm not mistaken. So it goes back hundreds of years.
Okay. How do you determine who is a Christian and who is not a Christian?
I actually determine it by whether or not people accept Jesus's resurrection. And so there are some Christians who are on the far progressive era, the progressive Christians, and I used to fall into that camp. And so I would have not realized that I was a progressive Christian, but for about 20 years, I was very doubtful about Jesus's resurrection. I thought Christianity was much less interesting than some exotic Eastern faiths. And I didn't even look into any of the evidence. And so I just was bored by it. I didn't think it was interesting. And so that's how I was. And then Jesus opened my eyes one day and everything changed.
So your theology has evolved some over time?
Quite a bit, yes.
Okay. What was your theology as a youngster? What was your upbringing?
Well, my parents are, when I was young, my parents actually changed and I've changed. So when I was young, my parents were Republicans. They were registered Republicans. Now my parents are Democrats, and my mom at one point was trying to rally behind Bernie Sanders. And so my parents have also moved away from the church. They haven't even stepped foot in a church, with the exception of a couple of marriages and christenings since for years. And so it's since I was in my 20s. And so I was raised a Catholic. I went through Catholic schools, and I went through Catholic freshman year of high school. And then I switched over to a public school, which I enjoyed much more because the Catholic freshman school was all girls, and I do not like that. And so I switched to a public school, and I went to a public university, several universities. And then I And then right in my 20s, I kind of fell away from Catholicism, and I thought it's just a default religion because I'm American and I was born here, and everyone pretty much I knew was Christian or Catholic or something like that. And so I sort of wandered around for about 20 years, just looking at Buddhism and all of these different faiths and thinking they were superior and doubting Christianity, but still nominally holding myself as a Christian and still occasionally attending church. And with my husband, we got married in the Lutheran church because that was his faith. And that's what his mother and my mother-in-law wanted. And I love my mother-in-law. So, and I still do. She's really wonderful. And so that was it. And then all of a sudden, boom, I started having these spiritual experiences after asking the Lord. I said, please just show me if you're real. I need to know your form. I don't want to be worshiping the wrong God. And so that was sort of what happened.
Okay. If I'm hesitating a little, occasionally I'm looking through the chat and checking for the comments to see if there's something we want to highlight or something we want to discuss. And I am not the best at multitasking, and so sometimes there's a little gap where, like, I was just reading Ricardo's chat, and then you finished. I go, oh, I've got to get back to what SJ was saying and keep the conversation going here. So if that happens, that's what's going on. I'm trying to keep everything going at the same time. Okay. Now you mentioned in one sentence there, Catholics and Christians. Do you consider Catholics to be Christians?
I do. I shouldn't have said it that way, probably.
Okay.
Yeah, I definitely do. In fact, I have found out a lot of anti-Catholic people out there. And I actually am surprised about it. I never encountered that when I was being raised. And maybe it's because I was in Catholic schools with like-minded people, but there's a big animosity against Catholics by certain sects of Christianity. So I have seen a lot of people think that it's a satanic thing and think the Pope is Satan and all this kind of stuff. And I was shocked when I first encountered that. So.
And the comment that from Ricardo that I was looking at, it is a good question. And he said, if you are born with a sinful nature, but you're unable to sin until you are old enough, when are babies turned from being godly to being fallen?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't have a specific age on that. I know that there are some Christian denominations that do take the case. Some say the accountability age is age 7. They just pick an age, and I don't know how you can do that. But I just say that and I think the wording that I used wasn't the best. Just like I said before, the idea of you're able to and unable to do it. I would just say that they don't do it when they're babies because they can't even think about what they're doing and craft together a message in their minds because they don't have language. And so once they get a little bit older and they're held accountable by God, whatever age he's decided that is, then that's when we might see some sinning that God would consider punishable.
Okay. Do you believe in free will?
I do.
Okay. And so do people choose whether or not they are saved?
Yes, I believe so. And I think you asked me this on Twitter, so I know where we're going here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does God have any choice in the matter?
Yes, God totally has a choice.
Okay. And how does that work?
So here's how it works. And I think this is what people get confused about. There's a few things with free. Actually, this is a little bit longer of an answer. Can I take a couple seconds to give this?
Yes, go ahead. Feel free.
Okay. So there's theological determinism and there's biological determinism. And sometimes people get those confused. Theological determinism is what Calvinists think. And they say that God has predetermined every one of our steps and everything we do, and therefore we don't have free will because God has already predetermined everything. I am not a Calvinist. I'm a Molinist more. I lean more to the Molinist idea, where God knows what we will, would, and could do under varying circumstances. And I feel like there's a lot of passages in the Bible that support that. But so he puts us in the ideal circumstances that would enhance the kingdom, if you want to say it that way. And so he put me in this position where I am right now. And I do believe that. But as far as the free will, the Libet studies and biological determinism is what a lot of atheists endorse. And so that's the idea that you're born with this certain nature and everything that you do is pretty much pre-programmed. But it's based on a study that's since been debunked by a number of other studies. So it's based on this Libet study that says that someone was put in front of a computer screen. People were put in front of a computer screen. Something would flash up on the screen, and they noticed that there was a time lag between their brains, signals in the brain that it looked like it was responding, and when they pushed a button. But what they found out after reviewing that and trying to redo those studies is they found that time lag, actually during that time lag, you have the will, you can decide whether or not you want to push the button, and some pushed it and some wouldn't push it. So there was a decision. And so that sort of eliminates this idea that this biological determinism exists to a high level. Because I also want to add to that, at the base level, when I get up in the morning and I get up and I don't think about things. I have this routine, these very structured actions that I take in the day. I get up, I do the exact same thing pretty much every morning. I let the dog out. I don't think about it too much. Someone would say at some level, at this very rote routine sort of action, of the structured action, is somewhat determined in a way. But if I go to higher level decisions, like whether or not I'm going to believe in God, and whether or not I'm going to accept Jesus, then those are the ones that I feel are fully determined in my mind. That's my free will, and that's the gift that God's given us. And so that's my explanation. So we do have free will to choose whether or not we want to follow God. But to split out how God relates to this is where the Calvinists, I think, have a little bit of confusion. Because God is omnipresent. So he's concurrently in our past, present, future. And that is super hard for us to grasp because all we know is linear time. And so God is outside of time and inside. He's both immanent inside the earth and he's transcendent to it. So he's outside of the universe. He's the creator of the universe. And so he's all those things. So in his position, he knows what we're going to do in our lives because he's already seen it. He's already seen the whole thing play out. And so it's like the author of a book. We're in the middle of the book and God has already read the whole book. So
are you thinking that God makes his choices based on the choices that he knows we're going to make?
Yeah, I think God puts us in certain circumstances, knowing what we're going to do and knowing how it's going to impact the bigger picture. So.
Do you think that whether or not a person is saved is the greatest question of the universe?
I don't think that's the greatest question of the universe.
Okay, but would you say it's an extremely important question?
Yes, I think that is a very important question. And it's such an important question that some people who decide that they're progressive Christians, like I used to be in contact with, what's his name, John DePew, he's one of them, and Laura Robinson and those guys. Some people, they call themselves progressive Christians because they've come to the idea that everyone eventually is going to be saved. And so they feel like God will unite people after death.
Okay, but let's stick with your view that God chooses based on a choice by man. So ultimately it's man's choice as to whether or not he is saved. If who is going to heaven is a very important thing, and the decision is entirely in man's hands, God's decision is based on what man decides. How is God sovereign if he isn't even in charge of who is going to heaven and who isn't?
No, he is in charge of all of that. And so
But you said God, that man makes that decision.
Man makes the decision, but it's one of those things where you're taking God and you're trying to squeeze him into our linear time by trying to pretend like God, there's a before and an after. God's omnipresent. So that means that everything is concurrent to God. And so there's no before he made the decision then, or I made the decision then. There's no difference in that with God. His nature is actually omnipresent. So there isn't a time lag.
If he doesn't make the decision, if man ultimately makes the decision of whether or not he is saved, then it's man's decision, not God's decision as to who is saved.
Yeah, I believe God is the ultimate decider. So
okay, then man doesn't decide if he's saved or not. God decides.
Man decides if he accepts the offer. And God knows whether or not he will accept the offer.
Granted, God knows, but is God in control of that decision?
So, well, God gives us free will but He is
So man is in control of the decision.
No. God is the one who's in control. God is sovereign. So God has already
So man can't
figured things
decide
out.
whether or not he's saved because God's in control of that decision.
Man can't decide if God has made the offer to everyone, which is what we learned from John 3:16. People have free will to accept or reject him. That's basically what it is. And so God knows which people will reject him, and he makes do accordingly. And so.
But then it's ultimately up to man whether or not he decides to accept God or not to accept God.
Yes, whether your fate is definitely, a lot of it is in your hands for sure.
So God is not sovereign over your fate.
No, God, I think we're kind of splitting hairs a little bit here, but no, God is sovereign, and he just happens to know. He's just his nature, and everything about him is just a lot different than us. And so
think about it this way. If I see my toddler heading for the street and I have the ability to grab my toddler by the back of the jacket and stop them, but I want them to have the free will to choose whether or not they are going to run into the street, I already can see that that's where they're headed. I know from experience of my toddler that my toddler is not going to stop. Whether or not I grab that jacket or don't grab that jacket, that's my decision, not the toddler's, correct?
yes.
Okay. So if man is choosing to not turn to God, and God is choosing not to stop me from making that decision, how is it not God's decision, but my decision as to what's going on?
See, we view it as the offer of grace. So God is the ultimate sovereign person who offers grace to us. Three persons in one, if you want to call it that. But he extends an offer of grace, and he lets us decide whether or not we want to accept it. And some people choose to accept it gleefully and realize that even in accepting it, I'm not perfect. I'm not, Jordan Peterson is afraid to accept God's offer. He said something to the like, because he feels like it would, the moral, he would collapse under the morality required. And I'm like, well, yes, we all try to get better and to be more like Christ, but we know we fail, and we know that it's not our works that get us anywhere. And so it's our faith and our trust. And so that's just the difference. And you can freely say, I don't want to be any part of this. I don't like the system. And that's what some people, like maybe yourself, have decided. You say, I don't want part of the system. Get me away from this. And so you don't want, to you, heaven wouldn't be heaven if people who didn't want to be there were there. It wouldn't be heaven that way. So,
well, actually, my problem is pretty much the opposite of that. And that is it's not because of who is going to be there. It's who is not going to be there. And here's the question that came up in my stream the other day is, if you go to heaven, will you remember your life on earth?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I'm actually not sure. I've looked into that in the Bible, and I haven't really found the answer to that.
Okay.
All I know, we don't really know very much about heaven from the Bible. So we know
the Bible really doesn't tell us much about heaven.
It doesn't. It says, Jesus says it's paradise. He says the thief is going to be with him, the thief on the cross next to him. So that speaks a lot about forgiveness. And he says that because the thief showed a little bit of faith, and we get a pretty good description in the book of Revelation of how it's going to be like a new Jerusalem and the roads of gold and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. If you know a lot of people and you love them very much, and you know that they're not believers, maybe your parents. Yeah, I'm not saying your parents aren't believers. I'm just giving that example because of what you said about your parents. But if you knew for sure that they were not going to heaven, could it still be heaven for you knowing that your loved ones were in hell?
Yes.
And why is that?
I don't view hell the way that you view hell. And so I view hell, I would have to say that my loved ones decided that they didn't want to be a part of heaven. And so that would just have to be something I accepted. And so if they don't want any part of God, and they don't want any part of the spark of divinity that he has offered us, then they have to, then they'll be in a state where they're without him, and that's what they chose. And so,
Okay, do you see hell as being a state of eternal torture, a state of total annihilation, or what do you see as hell?
see, that's a good question too, which I've looked into. I like that question because I think it's both.
Okay.
You can go. I think it depends on you. So we know that Satan and Satan's angels are going to be part of this eternal torture, the eternal torment, and all that kind of stuff. But then I think there could be destruction and annihilation for others. I think that might be the option. And I think actually, if I talk to some atheists, that's the option they would prefer. They say, I don't want to be with God. I don't want, I don't believe in God. Or else they'll say that even if they met God or they saw God or Jesus stood right in front of them, they still would walk away or they'd punch him or that kind of thing. I've had that response. And so they have said that they would rather just not be around anymore. That's what some have indicated.
Mm-hmm. But I'm thinking, do you not have any feelings for people who are not saved? Does it not bother you at all that they could be going to eternal torment?
It depends on if you think it's eternal torment or you think that it could be annihilation.
Well, either way, are you comfortable with people being totally annihilated just because they didn't understand God?
I think that it's a matter of the human will pushing against God. And I think that it's the human ego pushing against God. I think we've all been given enough information to show that God is real. I think I think we see that in nature. I know people who are atheists hate that I say this, but I look outside and I look at the tree. Yes, honestly, I look outside or right around my neighborhood and I'm like, oh my gosh, this beautiful, beautiful world that God has put us in. I mean, there's some ugliness in the world, but the thing that explains it really well is Christianity. We have to take up our cross.
Well, there's a lot of other religions that explain the trees too. I mean, there's creation myths in a lot of different faiths. So why would looking at the tree point you to Jesus and not to Allah and not to Gilgamesh and not to Thor or Zeus or any other faith that explains creation in another way?
That's a good question, because see, that's the distinction between the general revelation of nature and then the special revelation of Jesus. And so I think we're all given a general revelation. So you could be a Hindu or a Buddhist or something like that. In nature, you feel that there's something that goes beyond you and there's some sort of agency. And so then we go to the special revelation. And that's what I spent 20 years searching for, like I mentioned earlier. I wanted to know the truth. And so I prayed and prayed and prayed and found myself next to a pastor on a plane who told me to read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, and a bunch of other things occurred, and it was sort of a whirlwind over a few years, and I'm just happy to be back.
Okay. Do you think God knows what stops everyone from believing in him?
Oh, sure.
Okay. Do you think God is able to overcome each person's unbelief?
Do I think he's able to overcome each person's, really it's each person's free will and desire to not be with him. And so I don't think God tries to I don't think he tries to overcome. I mean, I have to qualify that. There's certain situations where, like when Jesus appeared on the road to Damascus.
Right. And that's exactly where I was going.
Okay, so that's the thing. So the great example that people say, like they say, well, what about, we don't have it. Everybody was following Jesus in the Bible. I'm like, well, no, not exactly. You had Paul who was sitting at the feet of St. Stephen's when he was stoned. So Paul's on the road to Damascus, breathing out murderous words about Christians, and he had just gotten permission to go be able to round them up and throw them in prison. And he was doing all this stuff with some friends, walking to Damascus, and suddenly he is reported 3 times in the book of Acts. He sees a light, it blinds him. He hears Saul, why do you persecute me? And he's, who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. And so Paul ended up being one of the most ardent believers in the whole New Testament. He wrote somewhere between 7 and 13 books, and he was tortured over decades, and he was willing to hold out. And then he ended up being beheaded by Nero. So pretty gruesome ending. And so he didn't give up.
And so if God was willing to do that, to bring Paul to him, why is he unwilling to do the same thing for everyone else?
It's a good question. I mean, the answer that the Christians would give, and what priests and pastors tend to say, is that God knows hearts. And even the Pope says that God knows hearts. And so when your heart is ready to be open to him, he reaches down there and makes himself obvious. And I think for 20 years, my heart wasn't fully opened. It was in a conditional movement towards that. But it wasn't until I think it was 42. I think that was the age when suddenly all these things started falling together.
Okay, now my life is pretty much the opposite of you. Well, mine started the same as yours, but then it took a completely opposite direction, and that is, I was also raised Catholic, but my parents left the Catholic Church when I was quite young. They left when I was about 7. So for most of my formative years, I was raised agnostic, but I turned to Christianity at 16, and I was a Christian for 42 years. And I started with the Evangelical Free Church. And because my husband was active duty Army and we moved every couple of years, I've been to a lot of different churches. And I first was of more of an Arminian philosophy that, that man chooses. And I moved to a Calvinist theology because I couldn't accept, when it was pointed out to me that the God of the Arminian view isn't sovereign. He has no choice in who is going to heaven and who isn't. And if God can't choose, and I've certainly heard your view that, God makes his choice based on what he knows man will choose, but that's still ultimately man making the choice, and God isn't sovereign. It's man deciding who is and who isn't going to heaven. So I moved to a Calvinist philosophy, or I should say theology. But my problem with the Calvinist theology was the problem of, what about everyone who isn't saved, and God didn't choose them, and why wouldn't God choose them? And once I left the faith and first of all, when I was a believer and my faith started breaking down like that, I did pray about it. I did seek God. I did continue to read my Bible, and there was no answer. So why would God decide to answer you and not me?
It's a really tough question, because I think that I look at what you just told me, and I can empathize with a lot of that, and I look at like a Tom Jump, who's shared with Craig Reed something very similar to what you're saying. He felt like when he was young, in his case, he was young when this happened, but he said prayers, and he felt like that he was in the worst time ever and God wasn't answering him. And so he said he didn't want to worship that kind of God if he's not going to answer his prayers, and maybe God was purposely ignoring him. But what I'd have to say, and I firmly believe, is that God answers all prayers, because he knows how this all is ultimately going to work out, and how it's ultimately going to be all about Jesus. And so
so you're telling me God didn't want me. He wanted me to be an atheist.
No. I think I think in your case, I think a lot of people, let me ask you this. Why did you leave?
It was a lot of things. But as I said, it started with, when I started thinking about people who were unsaved and why would God not choose them. A big part of it is when you look at the numbers, at a minimum, 2/3 of all humanity is destined for hell. And if God is the one that is in control of who is going to heaven, if God is able to save anyone that he wants to save, why is he making billions of people that he knows are going to all perish for eternity? That just doesn't make any sense. So that was part of it. Part of what really started turning me from the faith, though, was the Trump era. And as I watched the change in Christians around me as Trump rose to power, I saw a lot. I saw a real lack of empathy for humanity, particularly for foreigners. Close our borders. We don't want any foreigners here. The lack of empathy that I saw in my own pastor, who would ridicule people for being unbelievers or for not being in church every Sunday. And then he would say, now make sure you tell all your unsaved friends to come to church. And I'm thinking, why? So you can ridicule them during the service? No, thank you. And so I didn't turn away from God at that point, but I was definitely turning away from the Christians that I saw. And I left the Baptist church and went back to the Presbyterian church. But it really, even though the politics was better there and the empathy was a little better there, the doctrine wasn't any better there. I was still left with a God who is choosing to condemn the vast majority of the people that he's making. And the entire basis of my faith was the Bible. And I'd known for a long time that without the Bible, there is no reason to believe in the Christian God. That there is no support for the Christian God outside of the Bible. So once it was proven to me that the Bible was not inerrant, because the flood did not happen, and we know for sure that the flood did not happen, that's when it completely fell apart.
That's interesting. See, I came back to Jesus when I didn't even have a full Bible in my house. The earliest Christians didn't have Bibles in their houses. They didn't have any of that stuff, and they were still worshiping Jesus. So Christianity can very much exist in the absence of the Bible. We do have extra biblical sources that are ancient, lots of them, that actually, if you piece together their stories, you can get the whole Old New Testament idea that Jesus resurrected, the apostles believed, and they worshiped him. But the thing that you also said, I actually agree with you on some of this stuff with immigration and the Trump stuff. Here's what I saw, and I think you probably heard this too. I didn't vote for Trump in 2016, by the way. I was very much against him. And I didn't want him in office for a whole bunch of reasons. Most of it had to do with his personality and his morality. And so I thought I was doing everything I could do on Twitter to try to get people against him. And so, but then what I noticed that he did over the years that I kind of appreciated is I looked at some of the issues that were out there, like pro-life stuff. And I question the empathy of people who are so willing to just call a baby a clump of cells, or a termination of a pregnancy. I really question their empathy, because there's a little baby in there, especially the ones who look and see the ultrasound and they can see this little body inside of them. And they're like, yeah, go ahead and have an abortion. Then they don't even call it a baby. They call it a fetal cells or something like that, or a DNC. And I really wonder, 60 million people have died in the United States thanks to abortion since 1973. And most of them are a lot of Black people. It's actually very racist what's going on. And so I question that. And how do you deal with the abortion issue? Are you pro-choice?
I will deal with that in just 1 minute, because Ox has a question here that's quite good, and it goes to the question of faith. And I'd like to let you address this before I lose it, and then we'll go right back to abortion. Ox asks, if he opened up a lion's den, would you be willing to enter it and let God protect you?
Do I have the faith of Daniel? That's funny. I would have to say a lot of prayers before, just to see what God would direct me to do, to be honest.
Okay. Okay, going back to the abortion issue. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I just want to go back. So then we had the right and the left, and people were talking about what most concerns them. And for some reason, the people on the right, the conservatives, said that the immigration issue is the most concerning issue to them. It's life-shattering, earth-breaking. And then the people on the left said that Trump supporters are what most concerns them. And I'm like, what is this? One's a policy issue and the other's people. But
I never thought it was the people. I was always very much against Trump's policies.
Okay, well then, if I go back to the border, though, I think that I just want to let you know, I've actually always been and I don't call those people illegals or anything like that. I call them undocumented workers. And I've actually always been in support of giving the 12 million people occupying this country a path to citizenship. And I look at these documentaries where these people are in these little villages or little towns, and they're hiding out because they're so scared that they're going to get caught. And the kids are worried. They go to school and they're worried their parents, that they're going to come home and their parents have been deported or something like that. I'm horrified by that. And so I'm very much concerned. And I think your empathy comes out with how you dealt with the 27 people somehow sardined into an SUV in California who hit the semi, who 15 of them ended up dying. I think that's horrible. And the desperation these people have to get up here. We sit here like we're on the Titanic, right? Like we're the wealthy ones. We're going to be able to go and we get the ships, and everybody else, too bad with you. You guys can go down with the ship. I look at the same thing when I look at immigration, and I look at the desperate people coming up from the South, many with very good intentions, many hardworking people. And so I'm actually, that's one of the things I'm supportive of in the Biden administration.
Okay. Getting back to the abortion issue, do you think a person has the right to use the body of another person without their consent?
Yes, I believe that an unborn child who's in the uterus has the right to be born. So
Okay.
yes, absolutely.
So if a
believe that.
person needs a kidney donation and another person has a kidney that would match, that person can be forced to donate their kidney.
No, that's a false equivalency, because the kidney is used to flush out toxins. It's used for a different purpose. The uterus was made explicitly for a mother to produce a baby. And so the uterus is made for the baby. And the
kidney is used for your life as well.
The kidney is used.
The question isn't the function of the kidney. The question is the consent issue. Can you force someone else to use their body to save your life?
It's the issue of, number one, you have a responsibility towards your child as a mother. Your uterus, when you're in the age before you go to menopause, your body every single month when you're into young adult puberty to menopause is working each month to produce a baby. And then if suddenly a sperm appears, the mother goes into action. Now, the mother also should take responsibility for sleeping with somebody unprotected. And so, or even protected, but the birth control didn't work. What's that? Or if she's
what if she's not given that choice?
So if she's raped?
That's one possibility. And another possibility is one that you brought up, a failure of birth control. They used birth control, but it failed.
Right.
She didn't get a choice in that matter.
Well, she did get a choice because she still is having sex. And so
your solution is women should always refuse sex unless they want a baby.
No, that's not my solution. My solution is women can, there's other methods of protection men can pull out. There's all these, I don't want to get down to the
pulling out is a pretty, it has a pretty high failure rate.
Yeah, well,
it has a much higher.
Yeah, it's if you're so worried that the birth control is not going to work as a person, I would probably advise using more than one means of birth control, maybe beyond the pill, and use rubbers. Whatever it is. But I think once you lay down with somebody, you're accepting the possibility that you might be producing a child with that person.
That's why I say if you don't want a child, the women should all refuse sex.
Maybe some need to. That's,
another anti-sex league person.
No, I look at again, going back, because I've heard your analogy quite a few times with the kidney and the uterus. And I heard it on Matt Fradd's channel. I really liked this response that this woman felt like Jesus gave her. And that was the whole idea of what is in your body. Jesus said, I gave you the uterus for the child, and the kidney is for flushing out toxins. And so the kidney is for the mother. And so when you realize that part of your body was made to produce another human, I think it's your responsibility to take responsibility for your actions when you have sex. Now, someone say, well, what about someone who's raped? I have complete sympathy for somebody who's raped. And I would not tell that person that they have to take responsibility because that's not their fault. They were raped. That's 1%. It's either rape or incest. Sometimes it's less than 1%. But I think you should not make legislation based on these really extreme exceptions. And so just like we say that somebody can murder somebody else in self-defense. Now that's an exception to the rule of do not murder. And so.
Do you think a person with no brain waves is alive?
Do I think a person with no brain waves is alive? Well,
no brain activity.
I think life begins at conception. So it's a potential fully grown human life.
So after, what about end of life? If there's no brain waves, that's the definition of death. They're not alive. There's no brain activity.
So if we have somebody who has no brain waves, should we pull the plug on them? Is that what you're saying?
Well, we already do.
Yeah, some
that's
do.
The definition of death. Well, it's not just some. Because when there is no brain activity, that is the diagnosis of death. That is the definition of death. We don't keep dead people on machines for no reason.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to figure out what you're like. Are you getting at the idea of someone in a coma, maybe? Or are you getting at the idea of somebody who's a vegetable, whose brain has stopped functioning?
No, because that person still has brain activity. A person in a
Okay.
coma still has brain activity. If not, then they would be dead.
Okay.
But the unborn have no brain activity, which is the clinical definition of not being alive.
See, in my belief system, I don't try to do a lot of qualifiers. I just say that a baby, it's real simple. There's no arbitrary lines that are drawn. There's nothing like that. I don't say, okay, it has to be when you're viable at 24 weeks or 20 weeks or whatever, or it has to be, this is when you become a person. When you pass through the birth canal, suddenly we'll confer personhood on you. I believe that at conception, a life is formed, and anybody who discriminates against that life is guilty of age discrimination. That's what I would say. And size discrimination, because if you let that baby go and continue in the womb, there's a good chance it's going to be viable and come to life one day. And so I know there's times that you have miscarriage. I had a miscarriage, so I know that can happen too, but that's an issue for another day.
Let's go back to the original topic. One of the questions that I wanted to ask you is, before the creation of the world, was it ordained that Jesus would die for the sins of the world?
I think I think everything that we see that's happened, I think God already had. It's hard for us to grasp all that. But yes, I think it says it in the Bible pretty clear that before we were born, I am, so that sort of thing. And so God knew when he gave us free will that was going to require a sacrifice. And so that's the deal. He knew that was going to open the doors to sin. And so that's what happened.
So didn't God need man to sin in order for there to be a need to save man?
No, I don't think God needed man to sin. I think man just chose to sin, and God knew he was going to make that choice.
Do you think it would be possible for the world to exist without sin?
I do. Yeah, I do think it'd be possible.
Okay. So if Adam and Eve never ate the fruit, suppose they never sinned, they had the free will, but they chose not to sin, they never sinned. Why do they have digestive systems? There's no need to eat, you can't die. Why do they have respiratory systems? There's no need to breathe, you can't suffocate. Why were we created with all of these systems that only make sense in a body that's not immortal?
I think it's because God, it's hard for us to understand this, but God knew how this whole thing was going to play out. He knew that they were going to sin, and he knew that their lives were going to be shortened.
So he planned on sin.
You will surely die.
Even before creating man, he was planning on sin occurring.
He knew sin would occur, correct.
Well, he obviously had to have planned for it if he created us with systems that only make sense in a mortal body.
So yes, he knew exactly what he was doing. I mean, that's just the bottom line. God knew what he was doing at all points. And so creating a body that required food, required sustenance, all that kind of stuff. I mean, we go back to the Garden of Eden and you look at Adam and Eve and you look at what they were doing. They were farming the land. This is before the sin came about. Adam was naming all of the animals. They were doing tasks. They were actually working in Eden. People might think that heaven's supposed to be sitting around on clouds eating bonbons and listening to harps, but that's not the deal. It's going to be actually a productive deal. And so when you said about a world without sin, to me, the reason I answered that yes is because the world without sin, in my view, is what heaven would be. And so God has figured out a way. And one of the ways that I think one of the things that people don't really think about sometimes is, why are we in this world that has so much suffering? Atheism certainly doesn't explain that. But what does explain it is this idea that when we see, I mean, you said how much you appreciate empathy. Well, this world is designed for us to develop perseverance and empathy and love and all of those really good qualities that sometimes you develop because you see things that are amiss, that you don't like. I don't like abortion. You don't like the immigration. I actually don't like the immigration, the way people are. I mean, why are people so worried about immigration? I honestly don't get that.
I don't either. I
I'm
don't
like-
get guns. I don't get why Christians love guns either. That makes no sense to me either.
Well, I can see, and I'm not a hunter, and I've never even touched a gun. So this is where I'm coming at it. I don't like guns either. But what I don't like, what I can understand is if people who are raised, like maybe they're raised around the mountains, and they go and they shoot an animal, they bring it home and they cook it up and eat it. You know, they shoot a pig or something, and then they have a pig roast. I can kind of get that. I actually, do you kind of get that?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I don't have a problem with hunting, but I like the Canadian system.
Are you in Canada?
No, I'm not. But I've certainly read about it, where if you own a personal weapon, it stays at the police station. And when you're ready to go hunting, you go to the police station, you check out your weapon, you go hunting, and when you're finished it, you return it to the police station, you go home. You don't keep weapons in your house.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
I've always thought that was a much better system.
And I have to be, I mean, that's why I don't label myself. Now, I no longer label myself a Democrat, but I also don't label myself a Republican, because I have sides on both sides. I told you my immigration stance. I'm really not, I like how New Zealand actually bought up all the guns. And so I understand why people like guns, though I do understand a little bit of it. I think people feel like they need some sort of protection. They think there's going to be a corrupt government somehow rising up at some point, and they'll need to self-protect. And then because there are so many guns, if you're in your house, as a father and kids and mother, whatever, you might worry about someone breaking in, and now you feel like you've got protections. And so that's where the gun people come in. And that's why we have more guns than we have people here in the United States. You probably know that, like 500 million guns.
Lord Inquisitor has asked a question. He's asked this a couple of times, but he really would like to know your response. Is what was God's purpose in him being beaten with a Hot Wheels track when he was praying to God that it would stop?
Oh my gosh, that's terrible. Well, first, let me just say I'm so sorry, Lord Inquisitor. That's, I think, one of the big reasons, and I think just with you too, Kelly, one of the reasons why you guys leave is because of bad Christians. And maybe Lord Inquisitor was being beaten by somebody who was showing up to church every Sunday.
Yeah,
and
he was.
Okay, that's the kind of, that I hate that. I mean, I hate that we see that. I left Catholic Church probably for the same reason your parents and my parents left. And it's because I looked at what those priests are doing to some of the altar boys, and I'm looking at the Pope, and I'm like, what the world? I mean, what are you going to do about this? You can't just stand and not do anything to the Pope. And they kept looking the other way, and they're still doing that today. And it's infuriating. So why do we see this kind of stuff from, there's another girl that's on Twitter, and she goes by Enola Tan, and it's backwards for not alone. So Enola Tan was sexually abused over a bunch of years while she was a child by a relative. And she's written a little book about it, and it's very, very painful. And she said one day she was sitting in church and she was praying, and she really wanted to take revenge. I mean, she was so mad at this person. And she heard God actually audibly tell her that it was his revenge to take. He would take the revenge. And she never gave up the faith. And she always, look at how she was treated. I think that there's some really evil people in the world, but the answer to how we can get past all of that is to realize that, look at all the one person who wasn't guilty of any sin or any crime was put up on a cross and mocked and with a crown of thorns. And he took on all of those sins so that we could get to heaven. And I firmly believe that. And Lord, I'm so sorry that your father did that. That's horrible. I hate hearing stuff like that. That makes me, I was raised in a really good situation with my parents. They were just always so loving and friendly. And so I hate when I see this stuff that's out there, that people's parents do that to their own kids. It's just really sad.
Critical Cripple has a good question, which is, what if would an abuser still get grace if he asked for it? Does, if someone is the worst person imaginable, they've committed every crime imaginable, but on their deathbed, they are truly sorry, they are repentant, and they ask God to forgive them. So that's it. Now they're off scot-free.
That's actually the way the system's set up, as you know, because you attended lots of church. So,
and then God's promise of vengeance goes out the window.
Well, no, because I do feel that you could still face some of that. I mean, God might accept and forgive the person, but it doesn't mean that the person isn't going to face some sort of a punishment.
Where is that in the Bible?
Where is well, it says he is going to punish. God has dual purposes. He's actually got a lot of purposes, but God is the foundation of justice for us, but he's also the foundation of forgiveness. And so when he says that people will be punished for their sins, he said it just like with my friend Lori. He said, I will take the revenge. What the Bible does say, and this is where I think that some of this could work out, what the Bible says is there's a period, there's sort of a waiting period, and the Catholics, like call it purgatory. And there is a time where you're probably in some sort of state reconciling with yourself exactly, and reconciling with your conscience exactly what's happened. And so perhaps during that time, until the judgment day, which we do believe there's a time lag there, maybe that's the time when this person is feeling some sort of a punishment.
Okay, you kind of have to make up your own Bible verses to make that story work, though.
Well, no, you know that there's a judgment day,
there's
right?
the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, but it's just an example. It's not exactly a doctrine. And to try to base a doctrine on a parable, well, obviously you can to a certain extent, but I just think you're taking the parable pretty far if you're going to make up purgatory to go with it, to make it work.
Yeah, I'm not really making up purgatory. I'm saying that the Bible does make it clear that there is a judgment day. Right? So the book of Revelation says there's a judgment day. So we're not judged exactly when we die. There's one day where everyone's judged. You know what I'm saying?
So Jesus' death on the cross didn't get us forgiveness for all of our sins, but just for some of them.
No. We got forgiveness for anything we repent for.
But you just said we're going to go through a judgment day also for our sins.
We're still going to be held accountable. And
so we weren't forgiven on the cross.
So you're forgiven doesn't mean that they're not going to have some level of accountability and responsibility.
So what does forgiven mean if it doesn't mean your sins are washed away?
If I'm a judge and I'm in the court and I'm looking at a person who hurt another person, I've got two people in front of me, and this one person hurt the other person, and the person says, "I forgive you." Does that mean that the person who really hurt that person isn't going to have to face some sort of judgment? And
yes, but that's not the judge saying that if the judge says that you're forgiven, then there is no penalty.
See, I don't think the doctrine.
If the judge says, "I personally feel forgiveness towards you," that's not the same as being forgiven the sentence of the penalty.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it says, if you go through the Bible, and I know you have quite a bit, I would just go with the idea that people do. I mean, it says it in different verses. I wish I had them in front of me. I'm looking at a Bible right here, actually. But I think if you realize in there, it says that, like, for example, to whom much is given, much will be required. Much will be required. And so that implies that, and then there's the idea with the parable of the investments or the talents or the minas. And so we know that there's differential expectations. And so that means that when you go there will be certain expectations based on what your situation was and how you lived in it. And so you still have to face accountability. That's all I'm trying to say. It never meant that you're going to just die and then show up in heaven, and God's never going to say that, give you that flashback of your life.
What was the intent? What was the purpose of Jesus dying then? If you're going to face accountability when you go to judgment, what was the purpose of Christ even dying?
Well, the purpose of Christ dying was during the period of time between his crucifixion and his resurrection. Jesus went down into the underworld and killed death. Okay, so he killed the spiritual death, the annihilation, and then he made the offer: anyone who wants to believe in him will be saved. and not have death, not face death, and not taste death, as he puts it. And so that's all part of it too. So his intention, he forgave us, but he also, the main thing was he was able to unlock us from sin and death, and sin was binding us at that point.
So when you die, you get judged for your bad deeds, but the judgment doesn't go all the way to the point of death. Only people who don't believe get judged all the way to the point of death.
Only people who refuse to accept. I mean, it's the way you put it is so interesting. I think that when you said some prayers before, it sounds like you're really kind of a relatively recent convert to atheism.
Yes, I've only been an atheist for less than 2 years.
Less than 2 years, wow. I'm out of curiosity, I hate to ask this because people will get mad, but did anything bad happen in your life that
No. It was just that
it was watching Trumpers.
No, that was a piece of the puzzle, but that definitely was not the thing. And there really isn't any one thing that was the thing. There is definitely something that I point to as the straw that broke the camel's back, and that was watching the Ark encounter, the Ark protest. And particularly the final straw for me was when I looked at the banner that said genocide and incest park. And when I first saw that banner, I was angry, and I said, that's just rude. That's just, that's going too far. But then when I started thinking about it, I thought, they're right. The flood was a genocide. And as a result of the flood, God condoned incest, because the only people left were Noah, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. And so you had to have incest. You've got incest in the Garden of Eden. And so, yeah, the flood is definitely a story of genocide and incest. And when I started thinking more clearly about, well, and of course, then on top of that was listening to Aaron Ross speaking at the event, and realizing the thing that made me realize that not only did the flood never happen, but I've actually always known that and just didn't realize it, was when he mentioned that there are several civilizations that existed before the flood and after the flood, and we can tell from archaeology that these civilizations were never wiped out. And I know from my own study of history that he's right. And so, the flood never happened. And once I realized the flood never happened, that means the Bible isn't inerrant. And if the Bible isn't inerrant, it's not this perfect word of God. Now you've got to decide which parts of it are right and which parts of it aren't.
Yeah, I don't look at the flood in the way you look at it. I don't necessarily think that it's impossible that it had to cover the entire earth. I said it was the whole world, but it was like their world, all they knew in the world. And so that's how a lot of people reconcile that, is they say there could have been a local flood. And I think that, those kind of stories, the stuff in Genesis 1-11, I think a lot of that, people get so wrapped up in that stuff. And there's a whole division between the young earthers and the old earth creationists and biology and all this stuff. And they think, oh, you can't support evolution if you're a Christian because the Bible says, I don't think the Bible speaks against evolution. I could look at Romans 1:20 in KJV version, and it makes it pretty clear that fish turn into birds. And so there's kind of like some interesting stuff, but see, I don't think that I would let my interpretation of the first few chapters of Genesis taint my acceptance of Jesus's offer. And
this comment is another thing that is really problematic. All the Christians that think that threatening people is the answer. Granny, at your age, it's dangerous time to reject God. Yeah, as if your threats are really going to have an effect on what I do and do not believe. Thank you very much for the threat. And you're right. You can reconcile it by saying it was only a local flood, and I do recognize that people do accept that as a local flood. But there's just so many other things in the Bible that just don't work, like the Exodus story. According to the Bible, there were 2.4 million Hebrews living in Egypt at the time of the Exodus. And if you look at history and how many people were living in the entire country of Egypt, it was approximately 3 million. So if almost all of the people that are living in the entire country are all Hebrew slaves living in this one little city, obviously the Bible is wrong. And Holy Kool-Aid put out a video that just came out, I think it was just a couple of days ago, goes through the claim that they found Sodom and Gomorrah, and he goes through some of those as well, that the numbers that they're claiming that existed in Sodom and Gomorrah, in order for there to have been a population explosion after the flood, for there to be that many people living just in Sodom and Gomorrah, they've got as many people living in Sodom and Gomorrah as should be living in the entire country. And there's just so much in the Bible that is exaggeration, it's hyperbole, it's just clearly stories that are written by people about their faith.
Yeah. So where did you get the 3 million?
I got it from the Bible says that there were it was either 600,000 or 700,000 men. And then if you double that for the number of women, and if you add just a child apiece, you end up with 2.4 million people.
Okay, so you made an assumption that's 2.4 million based on, I mean, you're assuming that
because the Bible said there were 700,000 men.
Okay, so 700,000 men, but you're making an assumption
it specifically says besides women and children.
Okay. So there's an assumption built in there. But the other thing I was also asking, you said 2.4 million. Where did you get the idea that there were 3 million, and what time period are you picking for Exodus?
Oh, I don't remember. I don't have the history books in front. Yeah, the history places it. But
the reason I'm pointing that out is it's actually really
around
important.
1500 BC.
Okay, there's an assumption, and there's really good videos. There's really good videos on this, but we're not ever given the name of the pharaoh. And so people are making all kinds of assumptions on which pharaoh was there. And then they take that assumption and they build more assumptions. And they say, okay, the population during this pharaoh was this amount. And I've seen videos, one's called Patterns of Evidence that I highly recommend, where they actually looked at some of the archaeological data and some of the other data that's extra biblical, and they gave it I think it's Dudimos, but they figured out that Exodus must have occurred during the pharaohship of Dudimos. I'm pretty sure was one, but that's going against some of the current modern theory that Ramses is the particular pharaoh, and so it makes a difference on which person was in office as far as what time period you picked and the population statistics we've been able to gather from that time period. We also have to guess that we're making population estimates too, based on the time we did live in. And so, I mean, the Population Reference Bureau has estimated that 108 billion people have walked this planet. And since the year 1, 57% of the people who've walked the planet have walked the planet, which is kind of fascinating because 1 AD. Why that's fascinating is because hundreds of thousands of years prior to that, many fewer people walked the planet. So it's kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
No, I mean, it's really, I was talking to somebody called Wendy one time, and she actually didn't like that she was on my channel. After she saw me on Twitter, she decided she didn't like me anymore. So she asked for her video to be removed from my channel. But we were talking about, and she kind of reminds me of you in some ways. Her name's Wendy McClellan, but we were talking about Exodus. And she's like, the story of Exodus is just so ludicrous. Why would these people circle around this little teeny area for 40 years? They kept going up and down and up and down and up and down. And I'm kind of like, well, actually, if you think about it on the flip side, why would anyone make that up? Like, why wouldn't they make it a much bigger adventure, circling around all of Europe or something? That wasn't Europe back then, but circling around all of, some continent or something like that. Why would they just, include this little area? And it's kind of the same thing within the New Testament. We see all these things that are kind of embarrassing. Jesus' brothers tried to stop him. The women discovered the empty tomb. They weren't given any sort of credit.
Well, that wouldn't be embarrassing at all.
To me,
it was the women's job to take care of the body. It was the women's job to prepare the body for burial. So, is it not embarrassing? I mean, that's exactly what you would expect: is the women went to the tomb to prepare the body.
Right. But the exciting part about that from the perspective of a woman is that Josephus said that women's testimony was to be discounted, and women were the first ones to testify to have seen the risen Christ. And I think that's pretty great. I think it's great and shows Jesus' love for women, making us get that first
I
opportunity.
completely disagree with you there, but that's all right, because I want to go back to Exodus. The another thing that doesn't work with the Exodus is if they did in fact lap around the Arabian Peninsula for 40 years, and there were 1 million of them, or 2 million of them, or 3 million of them, how did they manage to not leave any evidence that they were ever there?
Well, that's why I say you should listen to the video called Patterns of Evidence. It's a series of videos actually, and it depends on which time period, because they have found archaeological evidence. For example, they found in this particular time period when a whole bunch of infants had been killed. The firstborn infants died off in that story, right? That's the Passover. The whole Passover sacrament for the Jewish people is based on this particular story. And so going all the way back,
that's supposed to be the Egyptian children that died, not the Israeli children.
Right. Well, that's what I'm trying to talk about. So the whole Passover.
Oh, but I was talking about, why is there no evidence of the Israelis in the desert?
I was just let me just get into
that.
Okay. So I just want to talk about some of the archaeological evidence that's surrounding this story. Now, the story begins, as people know here, the story begins where the Pharaoh did not want to let the Israelites go. And so God sent all of these plagues. And one of the plagues, the firstborn child, was going to be killed by a death in the night or whatever. And so what was found archaeologically is they found a whole bunch of infant bodies in these little graves when they dug up this particular time era. And the particular time era doesn't concord with the time area that a lot of people today are assuming when the Pharaoh was ruling, and which Pharaoh it was. So it depends on which Pharaoh you believe was in office at that time, if you'll find archaeological evidence. Because in that Patterns of Evidence, yes, there has been. That's just one example of much that they found in this. I think it's under the reign of Dudimos.
Let's stick with that idea for just a moment, because this is one of the things that I find the most horrendous about God. Is if we believe the Exodus story, and we believe that this is in fact archaeological evidence of children that died during the Passover, why does God go and kill innocent children to show off how great a God he is? Can't he do better than that?
See, you're on the assumption, and I'm actually, just as a 2-year atheist, you seem like you've gone pretty far into your belief system, but as you believed for a long time, I believe that there's a better life. There's heaven, and so I would believe that those infants are in heaven. And so that's
then why not? Then why not abortion? Because then those infants are going to go straight to heaven, and they're going to have a better life. Because
we're not sovereign. Okay, we're not supposed to be taking our own lives. We're not supposed to take the lives of another, and we're not supposed to take our own lives or the lives of another or anything like that. We're not supposed to murder. But
murder is okay for God.
It's not murder. Murder is a legal term. And so for God, he's moving people from one location to another. I know people hate when I say that, but that's the truth. The infants would go to heaven. We don't have the choice. The idea is God's sovereign. He knows what's best for us. So for us to say, I'm going to abort my baby, that's not our choice. God blessed us with that.
But
baby.
Doesn't God know that you're going to make that choice? And isn't he okay with that choice since he didn't stop you?
He doesn't need to be okay with something for him to, he wasn't okay with a lot of things in the Bible. He's not okay with, for example, divorce. We talked about that with, Jesus talked about that. And so a lot of things occur that God's not okay with, that he permits.
But he's okay with slavery.
He's okay with slavery. He permitted slavery. It was
right.
already.
That's the same thing, isn't it? If you permit it, doesn't that mean you're okay with it? He could have just outright banned it, couldn't he?
If you realize that was the economic foundation and backbone of every ancient society, that's how they formed their economies. That's how they lived, and they were able to, get food and things like that.
Okay, but
and you realize that what God did was he gave them regulations that treated slaves a lot better than the slaves were treated in the surrounding societies.
Okay, but why couldn't he just do that with, say, adultery? I mean, why not just make some rules so that you treat your sex partner better and make sure that your spouse is okay with you committing adultery?
Yeah, that's for some reason, and I have my hypotheses on that, but adultery and other sexual sins are pretty much among the worst as far as God's concerned. And
Now
so
that's a really strange. Why is God so obsessed with sex?
because our bodies are shrines and we're made in his image and we're supposed to use them in a sacred way. And so sex outside of marriage, sex is supposed to be between a married man and woman. So that's just the rule. And it actually works out pretty good for people when they follow that rule. So when you follow that rule, you end up a lot of times with families and good family structures with a mom and a dad who are able to take care of the kids financially because there's two of them and all that good stuff. So
How about
through the centuries,
homosexuality?
well, the thing about homosexuality the reason I'm bringing that up is because we perpetuate, by having kids, we're able to keep our societies going. And so homosexual sex, that doesn't produce any kids.
True, but you also said that a woman, if she doesn't want to have children, should not have sex. So
No, I didn't say, I said that that's one possibility. If a woman doesn't want to have children, that's one possibility. She could also go and if she really doesn't want to have children for good, she could go and get herself sterilized. So.
Well, couldn't she also be, isn't it okay for a lesbian to choose not to have children if a heterosexual woman can choose not to have?
Sure, anybody can choose not to have children.
So what's wrong with homosexual sex between two people who don't want children?
That's not my point. My point is that I was talking about why he favors one particular form of sex over the other forms of sex. And one of the things that we see in this society relative to ancient societies is we see a lot of sexual transmitted diseases, and we see a lot of premarital sex. We see a lot of that kind of stuff that actually you wouldn't have seen in the ancient Hebrew society. It was always people got married young, they had families, and then they died off pretty early back then. And so that system worked pretty well because it self-generates generation after generation after generation. Homosexuality is between 2 and 5% of the population. It's not there's no way to keep generating a new generation through homosexual engagement. So.
Okay, so homosexuality, in your opinion, is not immoral. It's just not functional.
In my opinion, I have, anyway, I don't want to, homosexuality, I'm not the judge of that particular act. Homosexuality in and of itself is not immoral. If a person is born, I think a lot of people actually get this from their genes. So if a person is born with these genes that give them a tendency to look at others in the same sex and they appreciate others, that's them. The Bible explicitly in the New Testament and the Old Testament speaks about homosexual sex, and that's the thing that God's against.
Okay, but would you not agree that the population of the earth right now, we don't really need more people?
I wouldn't say that.
I'm not saying that we should not procreate. I'm not advocating for that at all. But I'm saying that the decision not to procreate is not a bad decision because it's not like we need the population to grow. Correct?
At this point, we're approaching 8 billion people. So. Mm-hmm. And we have overcrowding in some places like China and India. Mm-hmm. So we certainly have some issues going on with the population, and it's probably going to level off, like people have said, around 10 million. So.
Okay. So if we don't need more people, and the primary reason you're giving for homosexuality being wrong is because homosexual couples don't procreate.
That's not how I was saying.
Shouldn't it be perfectly okay to have homosexual sex now?
Yeah, no, that's really misrepresenting what I said.
Okay.
I was saying why God created a system where he wants the sex form that he appreciates is the one between a married man and woman, because it ends up producing kids and a good family structure. And that's what I was saying. And I was just saying these other forms, whether it's adultery, whether it's polyamory, whether it's any of those kinds of things, those are outside of what God condones. Those are people's choices. And those particular systems don't perpetuate family units and long-lasting generations. So that's what I was saying. I wasn't trying to say I don't like. See, the thing is I'm very open-minded. That's one of the other reasons why I'm on the left. I mean, why I have leaned to the left on certain issues is I feel like people make their own choices, and they should be able to make their choices. And I think that people who are heterosexual or homosexual should be given these equal rights. I think that God views us all in the image of God, no matter what this image looks like. So.
Okay. We've been going for an hour and 20 minutes now. And I know that, I get a little thirsty, and I also can only sit for so long. So that's, and we've covered pretty much everything that I wanted to cover. SJ, are there any things that you would like to bring up that we didn't discuss?
Well, I think that here's what I think. I think one of the comments that somebody made and that you didn't appreciate is the threatening idea. And I can say that, just to go back to that idea, is someone like a Ray Comfort, who goes out there and he tells people, hey, you sin, you cheat, you lie, you do all this kind of stuff, and you're deserving of hell, and you're going to burn in hell. I hear that, and I think to myself, that's so cringy in a way, because I don't think that's, even though it looks like in his videos, some people think that's a pretty good approach. I look at that and I think, I don't know about that approach. I never, just probably like you, we didn't even talk about hell in the Catholic Church or in my Catholic schools. That was never even brought up. We only focused on heaven. And so I didn't talk about hell until I got on Twitter, and all these atheists were tweeting me and saying, am I going to go to hell? Am I going to go to hell? And I'm like, well, what? Why are you tweeting at me to say, are you going to go to hell? And so, because I hadn't given it any thought. And so I think that I would just, I try to say, you want to look at the carrots and not the stick, and you want to give them sugar and not clumps of coal. And so that's all. That's just, I don't agree with that approach. That's all I'm trying to say.
Okay, that's fair. I just found that rather odd, because one of my mother's problems with the Catholic Church was the whole idea of hell, and she was raised, with threats of hellfire all the time.
Really?
And yes, now she was raised in the late 30s and through the 40s, and yeah, the threat of hell was always there, and she had to go to confession and confess her sins so that she wouldn't go to hell. But the issue that actually caused my parents to leave the church was actually birth control. My parents had 4 children, and that's all they wanted. And they said, the only choices we have is we can stop having sex, we can get a divorce, or we can leave the church. And they didn't want to get a divorce, and they didn't want to stop having sex. So that was the end of the church. And
yeah,
the church was just too dogmatic when it came to the issue of birth control.
Yeah, the church, as you know, I mean, the church has a history of some really big mistakes. I mean, this idea that you can just pay for an indulgence. Do you remember that back in the medieval times? I mean, that's crazy. Give me a break. You pay for, I want to go ahead and sin. I'm going to go ahead and pay the church, $15 or whatever, and then I can go commit my sin. That's just totally ridiculous.
Yep. And yet that was widely held for quite some time, until Martin Luther came along. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Before we go, is there anything you would like to plug on your own channel, or anyone that you would like to show for before we close out?
Oh, no, I want to say thank you guys for listening. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me on, Godless Granny. You guys can find me at christian-apologist.com. I'm on Twitter, but I have a protected account. It's at dash, like DASH _023, if you want to find me there. But I try to just accept people I know, because one of the reasons I have a protected account is because, actually there's a whole bunch of reasons, but one of them is because I had people, digging up tweets from my account with 90,000 tweets from like 5 years ago. Sometimes I write things and then misrepresent me. And anyway, so it got a little bit stressful. So that's why I left. And so if you can find me through that, christian-apologist.com, and I will, and email me just like Godless Granny did. And then we hooked up. So it worked out.
Okay. And what I have coming up, I've got a video that I have under production right now that is almost finished. It's a response to Pastor Paul Washer and his video, God Chose You, God Chooses You. And I talk about the choice, did God choose or does man choose, as far as who goes to heaven. And then next Tuesday, huge day, Tuesday at 7 p.m., I will have Matt Dillahunty, Katie Montgomery, Brainbug, Esther, the African humanist, and Mel and scientist Mel. And we will all be talking about why are we here, a little bit about our channels, what we do as atheists, and anything else that happens to come up along the way. So do not miss Tuesday at 7 Central when Matt Dillahunty is here. And I do want to say thank you to everyone in the chat. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for being kind to one another. And SJ, I hope you enjoyed your time together, our time here.
Yeah, I did. And congratulations to you for getting all those kind of famous people on your channel. You come in here, you're in here 2 years and you just go at it, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
I have a few friends that have friends, and that's helped a lot.
So you have friends in high places.
Mm-hmm.
That's good. That's good. Well, congratulations.
Okay, everyone, live your life.